Hi there. I'm Cindy Linden, and this is the Cook Along podcast. I made a really interesting rice pudding recipe the other day, which I found on I'm Diego on Facebook. And what caught my attention, as always, was that it uses sweetened condensed milk, which, as you know, I am in love with. I like to clean the can with my fingers. So, of course, I was drawn to trying this recipe because it must be kind of like condensed milk sauce, which sounds great to me. My mother used to make rice pudding. It was a classic Betty Crocker recipe. And you had rice that you cooked ahead, and then you had eggs and milk, and you had to mix this all up and put it into a greased casserole dish. And then you had to set the greased casserole dish into some sort of a baking sheet that had water in it so that it would kind of steam and not get too hot on the bottom. And while I do that, sometimes it's a lot of work. It also took 20 minutes or something for the rice and then another hour in the oven. So this was not a quick fix dessert by any stretch of the imagination. Once it was cooked, you had to put it in the refrigerator because you wanted it room temperature or cold. So it was a big project, or at least it has always seemed that way to me. This rice pudding is much quicker and easier than Betty Crocker's. And since I'm the only person in my house who likes rice pudding, I figured that it would be better if it were easier, and it would be better if it used sweetened condensed milk. You know, I never ate the Betty Crocker rice pudding, which, as I said, I really like, without cream or some kind of milk on it. I guess because it doesn't really have a sauce of its own. It's just sort of a stiff pudding. It needed more liquid to it. This does not need that. In the first place, it already has 3 different kinds of milk in it. And in the second place, it's just a lot creamier than what I grew up with. So I tried this recipe, and it needed a little more detail in the notes. Diego, who creates these recipes, it seems he doesn't speak English, so I think he uses an AI translator. But he leaves out some details that really make the finished product come out right. So I have sort of taken some liberties with his description about how to make this, and I'm going to help you make it better, because my first version, while it tasted good, the texture was a little grainy and the rice wasn't done. And I'm adding a couple of little extra ingredients just because I think they might make it even better. So I'm calling this condensed milk rice pudding because Diego doesn't name it. In my house, when I was growing up, we had 2 versions of rice pudding. We had the plain one that my mother liked, and we had the one that she made for the rest of us that had raisins in it, which I really prefer, although I have also successfully done it with dried cranberries, which is good. Today, I'm going to suggest that you add some golden raisins, although regular raisins would be just fine. Dried cranberries would be just fine also, or you can leave them out the way Diego does. He doesn't require that. So let me give you your list of other ingredients. And this, by the way, will make 4 cups. It's quite a lot, since each serving is maybe half a cup, and that's pretty big. You've got 8 servings if you make this full recipe. I am making a half batch today. But for the full batch, you need 2 tablespoons of butter. And you could use salted or unsalted, doesn't matter. A cup of dry, long grain white rice. I've read about using some short grain rices, but I think they don't get as soft. So if you want a little chewier rice pudding, you might try a shorter grain rice or even an arborio rice. But the recommendation for rice pudding, because you want it soft, is generally just plain old long grain white rice. You're going to want 2 cups of water, and that will have to be hot. And that, I'm going to take a moment here to tell you, is your only do-ahead. You're going to need to bring that 2 cups of water to a boil, either in an electric pot or in your microwave or on your stovetop. 2 cups of hot water. It doesn't have to be boiling, but really hot. You need 14 ounces of sweetened condensed milk, which is a can. It's 1 3/4 cups. And then you need 14 ounces of heavy cream, which is also 1 3/4 cups. And by the way, in Diego's version, he uses something that they have in Mexico called table cream. And I saw a lot of debate online about what table cream was and what you could substitute. And it is apparently quite unique to Mexico and is different than anything that we have here. I sort of poked around to see if I could find any in local stores, but the only thing I could find was a jar, and it was pretty expensive, and I just didn't mess with it. The other day when I made this, I used regular heavy cream, and it was fine. And that's what I'm recommending here. And then you need a cup of powdered milk. I know not everybody has powdered milk in the house, but you probably should. In an emergency, it would be really helpful to be able to mix up some milk with some cold water. Or you'll find it occasionally in recipes, kind of like this one, used as a thickening agent. This is what actually brings the pudding from a sort of a soup to something that holds its shape. You'll want some cinnamon to dust the top with. Again, I'm going to suggest a 1/2 cup to 2/3 of a cup of the raisins or dried cranberries. You're going to want a pinch of salt and about 1/4 teaspoon of vanilla. And those last two things are my own additions. The salt because I think it will help brighten the rice pudding and make it not too cloyingly sweet because, condensed milk is pretty sweet. And the vanilla just because I think it would be a nice flavor in there. In fact, when I looked back at the recipe from Betty Crocker, I was surprised that it did not have vanilla in it. But a lot of the rice pudding recipes that you'll find online do have. So I figure, how bad can it be, right? If you have an opportunity to add vanilla or cinnamon to something, you should. That's all there is to it. For equipment, it's pretty simple. You'll need something to boil that 2 cups of water in. You need a large nonstick saucepan if you're making a full batch. The pan I'm using for a half batch holds about 10 cups or about 2.5 quarts. And yes, it's nonstick, but that's not urgent. The stuff we're making is a little sticky, and I think it's probably easier to pour out of the pan if it's nonstick, but I don't believe that it's a deal breaker if you don't have a nonstick pan. You will also need a silicone spoon if you're using a nonstick pan, or a spatula or something with which to stir everything. And you'll need a whisk for the end. I'm going to go away now for a moment and heat up my water, get it all ready to go, and then we'll start. Okay, I wanted to use my induction cooktop for this, but I realized that it makes too much noise. So I'm going to use my regular stovetop, which is an electric burner, and it'll be fine. It's just not quite as fast as the induction, but I never thought about it before. The fact that I can't do podcasts using my induction burner. So, all right, pan on the stove and put your butter in there, and it's just going to melt. We're going to let it melt here for a couple of minutes on medium heat. You can turn it up a little higher if you want to, just because right now the only goal is to melt this butter. It seems so slow to me on the electric burner, but it's coming. I cranked it the wrong way. How funny. No, I turned it down instead of up. All right, so that's part of the reason it was taking as long as it is. Once the butter is melted, which actually happens pretty quickly, you're going to pour your rice in there. And sort of just stir it around until butter coats all those pieces of rice. This is like if you were making a risotto. You want all of the rice covered or coated in the fat. We're going to just sort of stir it around, and then we're going to add the hot water, which I did in my microwave in a glass measuring cup. It's essentially about twice as much water as rice, which is your standard rice recipe. Diego asks that you just cover the rice with the water, and I found that it ran out of water too quickly when I did that, because you don't want the water to completely boil away. You need to keep some of it. in case you forget about the rice for a minute, you might need to keep some of that hot water on hand so that you can add it later. One of the things that I found was tricky about this recipe was getting the rice completely cooked. They were mostly cooked, but they were a little crunchy in the middle, which annoyed me with every bite, just because it was not what I wanted. I mean, if you like it that way, then more power to you, but I was not after that effect. So now what we're going to do, you're going to cover that pot with the water in it, turn it to sort of low heat, pretty low, and cook it for about 12 minutes. You might want to start checking it around 10, because again, you want most of the water gone and absorbed by the rice, but not all of it. So come on back to me when your rice has only a little bit of water left, and we'll stir in some more stuff. All right, well, my rice ran out of almost all of its water just before 10 minutes were up. So I am going to add just a tiny splash more. There's a little bit in there, but really not very much. I'm going to add another tablespoon or so. So there's a little water in there. And now we're going to start adding stuff. So keeping it on low heat, there's a little water in there. Rice has clearly not absorbed everything. Now we're going to add the condensed milk. You're getting it out of your can, or you've measured out enough to make half. And that's going in with the rice, right into the hot pan. Stir that in. And then we're going to bring it to a boil. We want it to boil over this low heat. I maybe turn it up just a tiny bit because the condensed milk cools it down almost immediately. And you'll see how creamy this is starting to be. Sorry, I should have taken a picture before I put the condensed milk in so that you could see how much water was left. But you're going to have to use your best judgment in that regard. But I've got pictures from this stage on the website, thecookalongpodcast.com, where you will find a lot of other tasty desserts, super, super tasty desserts. In fact, for a birthday party this weekend, I'm making my brownie cupcake recipe, which is just a stunner. We've got buttercream frosting on it. Oh, my God. Keep stirring this until you see it start to boil. And while it's still heating up, get your heavy cream ready. If you haven't already got that measured out, get your heavy cream, or if you can find it, the table cream, 14 ounces. I guess they come in like aseptic envelopes, sort of. Because in Diego's recipe, it looks like sour cream. I don't recommend you use sour cream. That will do something quite different to this recipe. But that's the texture of them. And clearly, the heavy cream is a lot more liquid than that. But I don't think that's a big deal. It certainly wasn't the first time I made it. And in fact, this pudding absolutely stiffens up once it's in your refrigerator. And I recommend that you either eat it warm or that you re-warm it. I mean, if you like solid kind of rice pudding, it's great chilled. But if you want something that's kind of creamy and soft, you're going to need to reheat it. Meanwhile, I want to tell you about condensed milk. So this is just starting to think about simmering. There it goes. Condensed milk, I have figured out two incredibly useful things. And I love this, okay? This is one of the hottest tips I will probably ever share with you. If you do not use a full can of condensed milk, which I am not today because I'm only making half a recipe, so I only used half of the can, you can put the rest into an airtight plastic container, or probably glass would work also, if you don't tend to drop things the way I do, and put it in your freezer. And you can use it again. It never gets completely hard because there's too much sugar in it for that to happen. So it's always in a usable state. And you can pull it out when you just need a little bit. You don't need a full can again. Keep it in your freezer like a staple. It should be there all the time. And here's the reason for that. Because the second thing I learned is when you're making whipped cream, stop using powdered sugar. Put in a little of the really cold, almost frozen condensed milk instead of the powdered sugar. It makes incredible whipped cream. I cannot begin to tell you. I'm going to set a timer here for how long we're boiling this. I'm going to make it boiling for 5 minutes. So we're continuing to cook the rice to try to get all the little hard spots out of it. We're going to need to test it in a little bit, but not yet. Anyway, there was a recipe for, I think, a cream pie of some sort that had the whipped cream on the top. And rather than sweetening it with vanilla and powdered sugar, it just asked you to add a little condensed milk. And oh my gosh, I can't tell you. It's just so much better. I don't know why. I can't define it. Maybe it's creamier or thicker or richer or something. But I have stopped making whipped cream with powdered sugar at all because I always keep a little of the condensed milk in a container in my freezer and scoop a tablespoon or 2 tablespoons or whatever to taste, obviously, for making any whipped cream I ever use. It isn't just that pie that benefits from this technique. Those are your hot tips about condensed milk. You will never regret having that around and easy to access. Yes, keep cans in your basement, but open one even if all you're going to do is freeze it and keep it accessible in tiny amounts in your freezer. This is now definitely simmering. It looks really good just as it is, oddly enough. But it's nowhere near finished. It's really part of what surprised me about this recipe, and the second reason I had to test it beyond the condensed milk was the quantity of dairy in here. I mean, if you don't do dairy, you do not do this recipe. It has 3 kinds of milk in it. 3 different kinds of milk in it. And that seems extraordinary to me. I know why you have the dried milk powder in here. That's because you need to thicken it. And I suppose that the heavy cream is what keeps it from being way too sweet. Plus, it makes a lot more pudding that way. But it's interesting to me that there's no eggs in here, and it thickens just fine without them. And I think it's the eggs that you have to be careful with when you are making the Betty Crocker version of rice pudding, because you have to separate them. And I never use the whites afterward. It just asks for the yolks in the pudding itself. And then they want you to make meringue to go on top, which I never have done and never will do. It sounds like a terrible idea to me to put meringue on top of rice pudding. Bleh. By the way, I meant to add a pinch, just a tiny pinch of kosher salt back when I put the rice in with the butter. So I'm adding a tiny bit of that now. It won't really matter that it's later than I wanted to, because it's an experiment anyway. But condensed milk and the cream will melt that just fine. But if you're listening to do this later, you might put the salt in with the rice. I also think that because this doesn't have eggs in it, it will be easier. Oh, there's my 5 minutes. It will be easier to freeze. And I don't want all of this in my kitchen since I'm the only one who eats it. I need to have it out of my sight. Right now we're going to add the heavy cream, which of course likes to stick to the measuring cup. So be sure you get it scraped all out of there with your silicone spatula, spoon thing. And stir that in as well till it's smooth. Anyway, was saying that I don't think you'd have a lot of luck freezing Betty Crockers. It certainly could be tried. But because of the eggs in there, I don't know how well it would do. And it's just a whole different creature than this. This is, I don't know how to explain the difference. When they're cold, they're both about the same. But when they're warm, this is so much more creamy. It's creamier than Betty Crocker's. Betty Crocker's is stiff whether you have it cold or hot. And I've always liked that. It's not a problem for me. But I do think that in terms of saving some of this for later by putting it in my freezer, this is the version. And by the way, I have to do that because I inhaled the last batch I made. It was very stupid of me, but I had a serving and then I had seconds. And then I was looking forward to the next day and had a little taste, tiny taste for breakfast. And then I had a serving for dessert at dinner, and then I had seconds of that, and then I thought, well, it's almost gone. I should just finish it so it's not sitting here tempting me, and so I did. So that's not the best thing. Once the cream has mixed in, and you can see that it's all smoothly mixed with the condensed milk, we're going to add the raisins if you're using them. And you may need to kind of separate them. They kind of clump together, and I want to have mine as individuals. Thank you very much. I'm using the golden raisins because I think they're fun in this. I stopped using raisins in Betty Crocker's and started using the cranberries. But for whatever reason, I prefer the raisins in here. And we're putting them in now so they can just plump up a little bit, you know, in the heat and the liquid. Now, put a lid over that. And we're going to cover and cook it on low heat. Keep it low for about 7 minutes. You want to keep an eye on it because you're going to need to come in and stir it every few minutes. So if you're going to forget that, you might want to set your timer for every 2 minutes or 3 minutes so that you get in here to kind of stir it up, okay? And then we're going to have to test it, and I will come back and tell you how to do that. Go away for about 7 minutes and come back when your timer goes off. Okay, now mine is boiling furiously, even though it was set on a very low heat. It's really going. And now we have to do something that will just make sure it's going to be okay. Get yourself a little spoon and dip out just at least 1 grain of rice. Keep it cooking while you do this. We're just testing for the doneness. It's going to be very hot, so be careful. What you're looking for is a rice with no crunch, okay? Yep, mine is good. Oh, this is so much better than last time. I did not like that crunch one bit. So, if yours still has a crunch, turn it down as low as you need to. And cover it back up and leave it for another minute or 2 minutes until the rice is soft, all right? For those of you whose rice is just fine at this point, here we're going to switch from the spoon or spatula to a whisk. And what we need to do now is add the powdered milk. Gosh, mine is already so thick it seems crazy, but I'm going to do it because it's part of the recipe. So put the powdered milk in there and your vanilla. And I suppose you could put more in. This is an experiment for me, and I don't want it to be a really prominent flavor, but again, I just don't see how it could possibly hurt. So I'm doing about 1/4 teaspoon. It's not very much. And then just mix that up with your whisk. And the reason we've switched from the spoon to the whisk is this. So when I did this last time, I found out that there were some lumps of dried milk that did not get mixed up. They were just kind of little spots of something dry and a little crunchy. It was not a good thing. So I decided we're going to use the whisk. And I'm going to stir it for longer than you really need to. What you want to do is to get it completely mixed in. And then, I don't know, maybe you mean to test it again. Because what we really don't want, is little crispy bits of dried milk in there either. We don't want the grains. Actually, it's not crispy bits. It's more like a granular texture on your tongue. And I thought it was interesting, but not something that was worth repeating. So here we go. I'm going to try this again. Yeah, the whisk helps. No graininess. All right, so we have only one more step here. This now gets poured into a serving dish. I shouldn't say poured because it's really too thick to pour. It gets scraped, scooped, and this is where I think it's been helpful to use a nonstick pan. This gets scooped into a serving dish or bowl, or individual serving dishes. You could do that too. And that's what I should have done if I'd been thinking, because that way I could freeze some of them. But I'll put them into some kind of container later. And right now I don't really want to freeze any of it. I want to have it around to eat, but that is exactly why I have to freeze it. And once it's in the bowl and looks okay, you're going to sprinkle it with a little cinnamon. Just, this is a sort of to taste as well, and it's going to eventually get stirred in. So it doesn't really matter. You can use as much or as little as you like of whatever kind of cinnamon you prefer. I use Penzeys blend, but there are also Saigon cinnamons and China cinnamons, which are really strong. And there we have the finished rice pudding. And there will be pictures of this on the website, thecookalongpodcast.com. If you find that you make this recipe and make modifications to it, or find that you do something that makes it even better in some way, in either method or ingredients, I hope you'll reach out to me either on the website or at Cindy@thecookalongpodcast.com or through Facebook, and let me know what you tried and what you liked and why you liked it, and I will try it too, because I'm always excited to modify a recipe. I rarely make them the way they're supposed to be. That is all for today. Thank you for listening, and until next time, happy cooking. Oh, by the way, you should eat some of this while it's still warm before you refrigerate it, just to get it at its most creamy. Oh my God, this is so good. If you like rice pudding, you're going to love this. Okay, bye.